There's a whole load of lessons we can learn from Jesus' encounter with the Samaritan woman. The first bit comes in the first verse where it says, Jesus discovered that the Pharisees had heard that he was gaining and baptizing more disciples than John, and so he leaves. And you would think at that point he would have a confrontation, he'd have a showdown with the Pharisees, because he's not afraid of the Pharisees. We see that enough from all the other passages. But he decides at this point to walk away. And first of all, that shows us that confrontation is not always the way to go. Even if it's people that we think are being incredibly self-righteous, actually sometimes wisdom is walk away. Don't engage with don't enter into confrontation unless we feel strongly that that's where God is leading us. And Jesus, it says, then goes through a place called Samaria. And this is a place that would have been avoided by religious Jews. People, they thought, oh, if I go into that place, it was a place that was considered unclean, full of the Samaritans who the Jews hated. So people would go on long journeys around Samaria just to get to a place where they wanted to. And it says that Jesus had to go through Samaria. Now, I don't think that means that he had to go through in terms of like he had no choice, because he could have gone around. But I think it implies more of a sense of he felt like he had to go through. He had some sort of urgency that there was something he needed to do in Samaria. And probably it was in this encounter with this woman. But he felt like, I've got to go through this place. Sometimes listening to the Spirit for the place that we need to go is something that we need to practice a little bit more. What's the logical thing to do and what is the Spirit telling me to do is not always the same thing. Jesus was open to the leading of the Spirit, and so should we be. And then he starts to have this conversation with the Samaritan woman. And one person I was reading who writes a commentary on this passage says it's interesting that when Jesus talks to Nicodemus in chapter 3, he has a conversation in the middle of the night. And when Jesus talks to the Samaritan woman in chapter 4, he has a conversation in the middle of the day at noon. And what that tells us is that there's always a time when God might want to use us. Whether it's midnight or whether it's 12 o'clock in the middle of the day, God will always have something for us to do. Maybe it's someone he wants us to text. Maybe it's someone he wants us to pray for. Maybe it's someone he wants us to go around and see. But be alert at all times of the day for what God might be saying in a particular moment. And then finally, Jesus treats a woman, the Samaritan woman, with such kindness. And there's lots of reasons culturally why he shouldn't have even spoken to her. Number one, she's a Samaritan. Number two, she's got a pretty bad history, and Jesus knew that. And number three, she's a woman, and in that culture, Jewish men did not speak to women in public that they weren't related to. But he breaks all of those taboos, and he takes her from a conversation about what she's interested in, water, to a conversation about worship, where she needs to be. For us, there is no one who is not on God's list for the people that he wants to show grace to. There's no boundary or nothing that we should put up that should say, I don't need to speak to you because God's not interested. Jesus is interested in every single person. And the way that we tell them that is we start with kindness and love. And if we do that and we start where they're interested, eventually they'll want to talk about worship.